Right now, roughly 1 billion people on this planet are living with a diagnosable mental disorder. Not in a bad mood, not a rough week, a measurable, classifiable disruption in how their brain processes reality, emotion, or fear. That's 1 in every 8 people you'll ever meet. And here's the part that should stop you. For most of human history, we had no idea what any of it actually was. We called it possession, we called it hysteria, we called it a moral failing. It took until the 20th century for anyone to seriously ask the question that this entire film is built around. What is actually happening inside a mind when it breaks from what we call normal? And why does it break in such wildly different directions depending on the disorder, the culture, and the century? Stick with this because it gets stranger than you'd expect. And by the end, you'll understand something about your own mind you probably never considered. Today, we treat mental illness as biology. Chemical imbalances, misfiring neurons, faulty circuits in the prefrontal cortex. We hand out a diagnosis, we hand out a pill, and mostly, we move on. That's the baseline assumption sitting quietly underneath almost every conversation about mental health in 2026. But that assumption is barely 60 years old, and it papers over just how differently each disorder actually behaves. Because depression doesn't work like schizophrenia, and OCD doesn't work like PTSD. And if you actually walk through the mechanics of each one, you start to see that mental illness isn't one thing wearing different masks. It's dozens of completely different malfunctions, each with its own history, its own famous case, and its own brutal internal logic. So let's go through them one at a time. Start with depression, because it's the one everyone thinks they understand, and almost nobody does. Major depressive disorder affects around 280 million people worldwide, according to World Health Organization estimates, and it is not sadness. Sadness passes. Depression, clinically, requires at least 2 straight weeks of a depressed mood or loss of interest in nearly everything, alongside symptoms like disrupted sleep, disrupted appetite, and a specific kind of mental fog that researchers call psychomotor slowing. Your thoughts and even your movements physically decelerate. In the 1960s, a psychiatrist named Aaron Beck was trying to prove Freud's theory that depression was anger turned inward. Instead, while running word association studies on his patients, he noticed something else entirely. Their depression wasn't fueled by buried rage. It was fueled by a constant stream of automatic negative thoughts. I'm worthless. Nothing will change. This is my fault, running on a loop they weren't even aware of. That discovery became cognitive behavioral therapy, one of the most effective treatments in psychiatric history. And it came from Beck essentially throwing out his own hypothesis because the data told him something different. Here's the mechanism in plain terms. Depression isn't one broken part. It's a feedback loop, where low serotonin and dopamine activity blunts your brain's reward system, so nothing feels good. So you stop doing things that used to feel good, so your brain gets even less stimulation, so the depression deepens. It's a downward spiral with its own momentum. Sound familiar? Because that same feedback loop structure, a small deficit that snowballs through behavior, shows up again and again in this list. Now compare that to obsessive compulsive disorder, which looks nothing like depression on the surface, but runs on eerily similar wiring. OCD affects about 1 to 2% of people globally, and it isn't about being tidy or liking things a certain way. That's a myth that trivializes an actually agonizing condition. It's a 2-part cycle, an intrusive, unwanted thought, an obsession, like a sudden fear you left the stove on, or a horrifying image you didn't ask for, followed by a compulsion, a ritual behavior meant to neutralize the anxiety that thought creates. Checking the stove 11 times. Wash your hands until they bleed. Here's where it gets interesting. Brain imaging studies, particularly work out of UCLA led by psychiatrist Jeffrey Schwartz in the 1990s, showed that people with OCD have measurably hyperactive activity in a loop connecting the orbitofrontal cortex and the caudate nucleus, a neural circuit responsible for detecting something is wrong, fix it. In a healthy brain, that circuit fires. You check the door once, it quiets down. In an OCD brain, it doesn't quiet down. It just keeps firing the same danger signal, even after you've checked the door 5 times. So the compulsion never actually resolves the anxiety. It just buys 40 seconds of relief before the loop restarts. Schwartz's own treatment breakthrough came from teaching patients to relabel the intrusive thought, literally saying, "This is my OCD talking, not a real threat." And functional MRI scans later showed that reframing physically reduced activity in that overactive circuit. You're not fighting a bad habit. You're fighting a stuck alarm system. Then there's schizophrenia. And this is where a lot of people's mental model of mental illness completely breaks down, because schizophrenia isn't an amplified version of a normal emotion the way depression or anxiety is. It's a fundamentally different relationship with reality itself. It affects roughly 24 million people worldwide, about 1 in 300, and it typically emerges in the late teens to early 30s. The hallmark symptoms are hallucinations, usually auditory, hearing voices that feel completely real, and delusions, fixed false beliefs that don't respond to evidence. German psychiatrist Emil Kraepelin first separated it out as dementia praecox in 1893, convinced it was a degenerative brain disease striking the young, and he spent decades meticulously cataloging thousands of patient case histories by hand, essentially building the entire framework of modern psychiatric diagnosis off sheer obsessive record-keeping. Here's the mechanism nobody explains well. One leading theory, the dopamine hypothesis, suggests that overactive dopamine signaling in certain brain pathways causes the brain to assign excessive salience or importance to random internal and external stimuli. Translation: your brain has a system that tags what deserves your attention, and in schizophrenia, that tagging system misfires, so a random thought or a stray noise gets flagged with the same urgency as a genuine threat, and the brain, doing its job, tries to make sense of that false urgency by constructing an explanation. A delusion isn't a broken imagination. It's a logical, if tragic, attempt to explain a nervous system that's screaming important about things that aren't. Bipolar disorder gives you the mirror image problem, not a fixed misfiring, but a system that swings wildly between two extremes. It affects about 40 million people globally, and it cycles between manic or hypomanic episodes, elevated mood, racing thoughts, decreased need for sleep, sometimes reckless spending or risk-taking, and depressive episodes that look clinically identical to major depression. The composer Robert Schumann is one of history's most studied probable cases, and his personal diaries show it in real time. In productive manic stretches, he composed astonishing amounts of music, once writing an entire symphony in 4 days, while in depressive stretches, he described being unable to lift a pen. He eventually attempted to drown himself in the Rhine in 1854 and spent his final 2 years in an asylum. Here's the mechanism. Researchers, including work led by American psychiatrist Kay Redfield Jamison, who has bipolar disorder herself, and turned that lived experience into some of the field's most influential research, point to dysregulation in the brain's circadian and reward systems, meaning the internal clock and the dopamine-driven motivation system lose their normal governors. A regulated brain has damping mechanisms that pull mood back toward baseline. In bipolar disorder, those damping mechanisms are too weak, so a small uptick in energy or motivation doesn't level off. It accelerates, feeding on itself until it becomes mania, the same way an amplifier with too much gain doesn't just get louder, it screeches into feedback. Now take PTSD, because this is the one that proves mental disorder isn't always about a brain malfunctioning from the start. Sometimes it's a brain doing exactly what it's supposed to do, just permanently. Post-traumatic stress disorder develops in roughly 6 to 9% of people who experience a traumatic event, and it was only formally added to psychiatric diagnosis in 1980, largely pushed forward by clinicians treating Vietnam veterans and by psychiatrist Judith Herman, whose 1992 book, Trauma and Recovery, reframed the condition around a core insight. Trauma isn't just a bad memory, it's a memory that never got filed away properly. Here's the mechanism. Under extreme threat, your amygdala, the brain's alarm center, hijacks normal memory processing in the hippocampus. So instead of a traumatic event being stored as a linear, past-tense memory, that happened to me once, it gets stored as fragmented sensory data, a smell, a sound, a flash of image, without a proper timestamp. That's why a flashback doesn't feel like remembering. Your nervous system genuinely believes the threat is happening again, right now, because the part of the brain responsible for saying, "This is over," never finished its job. But here's what nobody tells you. This isn't a defect. It's the same threat detection system that kept your ancestors alive, just stuck in the on position long after the danger has passed. Compare all of that to anorexia nervosa, and you'll see the pattern shift again, because here, the malfunction isn't in perception of threat, it's in perception of the self. Anorexia has the highest mortality rate of any psychiatric disorder, with estimates around 10% of sufferers dying from medical complications or suicide over the long term. German-American psychiatrist Hilde Bruch spent decades in the mid-20th century treating patients with the condition, and became convinced the core issue wasn't vanity or dieting gone too far. It was a profound disturbance in body perception, combined with a desperate need for a sense of control, often in patients who felt they had control over nothing else in their lives. Here's the mechanism. Functional imaging studies show that in anorexia, the insula, the brain region responsible for interoception, meaning your ability to accurately sense your own body's internal state, processes hunger and body size signals abnormally, so patients can be objectively emaciated and still generate a genuine, non-negotiable sensory experience of being overweight. It's not a distorted opinion, it's distorted data coming from the sensor itself. And finally, dissociative identity disorder, probably the most misunderstood entry on this list because of decades of sensationalized portrayals. It's rare, affecting roughly 1 to 1.5% of the population by some estimates, and it almost always traces back to severe repeated childhood trauma. Canadian psychiatrist Colin Ross, who has spent his career researching the condition, describes the mechanism simply. A child facing unbearable, repeated abuse doesn't have the option to physically flee, so the mind does the only thing it can to compartmentalize. Different states hold different memories, emotions, or even physical sensations tied to the trauma, functioning almost like separate rooms in a house that don't share a hallway. It's not multiple people. It's one mind that learned as a survival strategy to keep its most unbearable experiences behind separate doors, and those doors never fully reopened, even once the danger was gone. So look at what you've actually got by now. You've got depression, a feedback loop starving its own reward system. You've got OCD, a stuck alarm circuit that won't stop signaling danger. You've got schizophrenia, a salient system flagging the irrelevant as urgent. You've got bipolar disorder, a mood regulator with no functioning brakes. You've got PTSD, a threat detection system frozen mid-alert. You've got anorexia, a body sensing system reporting false data. And you've got dissociative identity disorder, a mind that split itself to survive what it couldn't escape. 7 completely different disorders, 7 completely different points of failure. But here's the unifying thread running underneath every single one of them. Every mental disorder on this list is at its core a normal, adaptive brain system running exactly as designed, just in the wrong context, at the wrong intensity, or for far too long. The alarm system that keeps you alive in a war zone is the same one that traps a veteran in a flashback decades later. The reward system that makes you seek pleasure and connection is the same one that collapses into depression's downward spiral. The threat tagging system that lets you notice a predator in the grass is the same one that generates a delusion. Nothing about the mentally ill brain is foreign to the healthy one. It's the same architecture, tuned differently, sometimes by genetics, sometimes by trauma, sometimes by pure chance and how a circuit developed. That's the thing psychiatry took 100 years and thousands of ruined, institutionalized, misunderstood lives to figure out. And that's really the thought worth sitting with. Somewhere back at the start of this, you were told that 1 in 8 people alive right now is living with one of these conditions. That's not an abstraction. That's the person next to you on the train, replaying an intrusive thought for the 40th time today.